So welcome and hello everyone to our seminar in the series Gender Research in Action. In this multidisciplinary series, we draw from diverse backgrounds and countries of expertise and provide space for discussing approaches and nuances of research on gender in relation to environment, development, and beyond. Today, it is hosted by Rob Ferrito, a DPhil student on gender and industrialization. He's our main moderator, and he's disguised under the name questions. So all your questions are going to him, and he will moderate them. We also have a co-host, Dr. Maria Hillesland, Research Officer in Development Economics in the Department of International Development, and myself, Dr. Marina Korzanevic. I'm a human geographer at the School of Geography and Environment. We represent University of Oxford, and we are also affiliated with the Project REACH, a global research program to improve water security for the poor by delivering science that transforms policy and practice. It is our 6th seminar already in the series, and you're very welcome to watch previous series on the YouTube. Likewise, we will upload today's seminar on YouTube, and you can see it on your chat box. Before we start, I would like to briefly introduce the format. We will have the presentation for 20 to 30 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. You're welcome to type questions at any time, and depending from the time and density of the questions, we might group them. Now I would like to introduce with a really great pleasure, Dr. Deepa Joshi, whose work I have been admiring for quite a long time. She's a Gender, Youth and Inclusion Officer at WLE and International Water Management Institute. She's a feminist political ecologist whose work analyzes shifts in environmental policies and how these restructure contextually complex intersections of gender, poverty, class, ethnicity, and identity. Her published findings present ethnographic analysis of how the complexity of inequity is reiterated across institutions in the rules and processes of policymaking, in policies per se, and in implementing institutions at scale. And before joining EMI, she used to work at Coventry University, Wageningen University, and DPhil. So now, Deepa, I'm really happy to give the floor to you. And so to listen to your presentation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Marina. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this session today. Thank you, Marina, for the invite to present my work. And I just thought it would be great if I can also switch off my camera. It's a bit awkward speaking to myself, and I see my image looming large in front of me. So hopefully now that you've seen me, I can close my video as well. So I'm Deepa Joshi. I'm the Gender and Social Inclusion Lead at the International Water Management Institute. And the work that I did on this project was completed when I had moved from IMI, but the project itself had started when I was at Coventry University as associate professor. So my colleagues from Coventry who worked with me are Jasbir Singh, and from the Bangladesh Agriculture University, we had Professor Sadika Haq and 2 MSc students, Kamrun Nahar and Shahinur Tania. And we also worked very closely with a theater group, an activist theater group called Bot Tala, which means under the banyan tree in Bangla, in the project that we did. So in today's presentation, I want to speak about.
Deepa, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, the last. I think I just heard about the different master students involved, and then I didn't hear. But might be my connection.
Okay. Okay. So anyway, let me emphasize that in the presentation today, I'm going to be talking about a REACH project that allowed us some insights into gender, water, intersections in peri-urban Dhaka and to look at it through the experiences of ready-made garment factory workers. But building on that work, we now have a new project called Transforming the Rules of the Game, Gendered Livability in Peri-urban Dhaka. So I'll talk first about the former project, and then in the very end, I'll give you some introduction to the new project, which we haven't quite started because of COVID. So let me proceed now with the rest of my presentation. And if I'm unclear at any point, please do let me know. Or if I'm not audible, please do flag that out to me as well. Oops, seem to be struggling. Okay, so in 2019, there was something that was really intriguing that we were looking at in relation to gender in Bangladesh, gender in Bangladesh. And this was also because I've had a long history of working in Bangladesh. I've worked there for almost 10 to 12 years. So this is a country that I closely follow in looking at water and gender, especially in the urban, peri-urban context. So what was really key was that Bangladesh was really emerging as South Asia's fastest growing economy, and that status that it has still holds and has continued despite of COVID. And also what was really intriguing was that in subsequent World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap reports starting 2018, up until 2021, the last report, Bangladesh leads in South Asia in closing the gender gap. And currently, Bangladesh in the 2021 report ranks 65 out of 156 countries, ahead of some European countries like Greece and many others in the region and elsewhere. And of course, this is something that was an issue of great pride in Bangladesh, that Bangladesh was the most gender equal country in South Asia. And a lot of this achievement was being tracked and linked to the fact that almost 80% of the 4.2 million workers who were employed in Bangladesh's ready-made garment factories were women. And of course, that the RMG industry, the ready-made garment industry, was a key contributor to the national GDP. And it was not just statistics from the global gender gap reports that were emphasizing that Bangladesh was closing, and very swiftly, the gender gap. It was also researchers, both local and international, who are identifying that paid work in the ready-made garment industry had really made an impact on the poorest marginalized women in Bangladesh, that not only did they gain income, but because of the income gained, they were also said to have a greater autonomy, more bargaining power within the household, expanded choices, and gains in power more generally also beyond the household. With the analysis that this sort of overall achievement was actually enabling them to be able to make choices and as well as act upon these choices, which is precisely the definition of empowerment. So there were a lot of researchers who were identifying that the ready-made garment industry, therefore, could be attributed to having empowered Bangladeshi women. I think so the question that we really wanted to ask through the REACH project proposal was this, that if women were indeed empowered as an outcome of their paid ready-made garment work, were they better able to negotiate their domestic water roles and responsibilities at home? And were they also able to influence water use management and governance decisions in the public domain? And now, why were we asking these questions? Why were we linking empowerment to water and water decision making? Well, the reason being that, the fundamental reason being that women, hold entrenched domestic roles and responsibilities, which are really difficult to transform and share with men. And in fact, I think that has been the biggest finding that COVID-19 has demonstrated, that the women's domestic work happens in addition to their increasing productive work outside of the house. And so for these workers who have extremely long hours of work, 8 to 10 hours of work with one holiday in the week, we wanted to find out how were they managing their domestic water-related roles and responsibilities if they were spending the whole day in the factories and working really hard, returning home tired. And also, the question about water management, access and governance was important because of the fact that earlier research had pointed out that, and also my own research in Bangladesh has made it very clear that, most of the slums in Bangladesh in the urban area are only recently being connected to public water supply. And in the peri-urban context in which our research, the REACH project, was located, is an institutional vacuum. So it's neither rural nor urban, definitely no extension of public water supply in these areas. So how were women managing water-related work for which they are essentially engaged in when they are also spending long hours outside their homes and inside the factories? And the thing that was also of intrigue, which also relates to the current context, was the fact that, especially now post-COVID, we're all talking about a new normal. Although we don't quite know what this new normal might mean in terms of science, knowledge, and research. What will we do differently, that would contribute to and have an impact on the new normal? I have a little bit of a problem with my cursor, so please bear with me. So therefore, the questions that we wanted, the research, for our focus of the research was not just in answering the research question that we had posed, but really also looking at the how and the why of doing research. So how are we going to do the research? And why were we doing this research anyway? Because, there's like countless number of studies which identify these contentious water challenges that women in peri-urban Bangladesh experience, or urban Bangladesh marginalized women experience. So why were we doing another layer of research? So before I go there, I want to ask you a question. If you read this quote or part of a quote, if you could just put up your hands or give me some indication as to, how many of you think that this quote is COVID related and is a recent quote? Maybe you could post your answers in chat so I could have a look. Are there any response? Okay, not COVID related. Do you think this is a quote that is relatively recent, or you think it's not? Not recent, okay. Anybody else? Okay, so it's interesting, Marina is saying that you could apply this quote to your work site in Kenya, but it's not COVID related. Also, somebody else says it's not quite recent. Interesting. Indeed, it's not recent. And this was a quote that Henry Truman, one of the former American presidents, made in 1941 at the start of the Green Revolution. So he was talking about the fact that more than half of the people in the world are living in conditions approaching misery, and the rest of the quote that goes on to explain that Truman believed that science and technology would be an answer to this, precisely through the Green Revolution. However, as Marina identifies, that this situation could relate to her research location in Kenya, and indeed it could relate to the situation in Bangladesh. The issue is that it seems that science and technology have really not been able to tackle this issue. So, and of course, that brings us down to the issue about our research approach and methodology, which is so central to the science we produce and the knowledge that emerges out of it. So, does it mean that there is something fundamentally flawed with the way that we are doing research, or with the science that emerges, the knowledge that emerges out of this research? So there is a small, I say relatively small, group of researchers who have been questioning the politics of knowledge and science, including my colleagues at Coventry University, who have written this very interesting book. And I leave you for just a minute to read the quotes. The fact that research is very exclusionary, and it's very top-down, and even in so-called participatory research, the people who are engaged hardly do so on equal terms. And so could as we were planning and designing this research, our focus was also really to try and sort of grapple with this issue of how did we want to do the research, and why were we doing this research in the first place? Because the reality is that although we talk about poverty, gender, and impact of our research agenda is not, and we talk about science and research being objective, the reality is that politics is very much embedded in all of this, in the science, in knowledge, in technology, in the ways we think about these issues. And so it's hardly surprising that, especially post-COVID and in the talk of the new normal, that we are paying more attention to words and terms like transformative, transdisciplinarity, citizen, decolonial science. And so what do we mean by these issues, and how might these issues inform the way in which we do research and the way in which we pose questions of why the research. So for me, having worked in Bangladesh for a very long time and having understood that the links between water, marginalized women, urban and peri-urban context is so explicit, it was really, how did I want to answer this water question? And that was, again, going back to the REACH project objectives of water security for the poorest and the focus on gender, which sometimes tends to get loosely translated into women. And so the issue really was that how ethical would it be to go into the locations in which of our work and to be focusing on water-related issues which were a priority to us, which might be a priority for these for our respondents, but also that there are so many other challenges that they're grappling with. And it's only occasionally when there are calamities and crises that these challenges get paid attention to. So there was a lot of, for example, attention to RMG workers and their living and working conditions post the 2013 fire that took place in several factories in Bangladesh. And so this was news reporting from Reuters, and it was only occasionally that there were these excellent insights, like we're also really looking into the lives of these women, because a lot of it was just about reporting numbers, dead, etc., etc. So fundamental to our research project was the how of and the why of research, and the fact that often it's really audacity that we as researchers have, in which we take very complex realities of people's lives and then we try to simply order them very simply into ways that are appropriate for us, often making very binary distinctions between diverse groups of women and men, and then asking very pervasive questions in ways that are, as Linda Scott points out, implicitly or explicitly disempowering to the women whose empowerment is being assessed. So for example, a lot of WASH-related questions about diarrhea, like how many times do you have diarrhea last month? If it is about violence and agency, then it's about how often does your husband hit you now compared to last year, or how much money are you making? Questions like these posed to very, very poor and marginalized women. And even more shocking is the fact that the outcomes of these analyses, including claims of empowerment that you read about in many documents, including related to RMG women workers in Bangladesh, are rarely shared back with the respondents. So what we really wanted to grapple with in this research was this issue of transformative, transdisciplinary research, which really is about recognizing, acknowledging, and respecting the plurality of knowledges, and especially those who experience these crises that we love to analyze as researchers, understanding the complexity and especially the socio-technical intersections of the issues that we are identifying, and also understanding that sometimes to really understand issues and to break the power hierarchies, there is need for more disruptive approaches, and often disruptive is something that is a word that's tied, that has a very negative connotation, but actually it is so fundamental to transformative and supposedly to the new normal. So I just pulled up these examples to show that it's not just a group of social scientists and anthropologists who are looking at these issues, but it's also climate scientists increasingly. And this is a group called Climate for Change, and in which they apply a 3 spheres of transformation framework, which looks at the personal, the political, and the practical as a way of understanding complex realities and also identifying transformative pathways out of these issues. And also understanding that the focus on relationships, the focus on narratives is really instrumental and key to the crises that we encounter, different crises at different times. But really what is fundamental is that it is inequality at personal, practical, and political levels that combine to create these types of vulnerabilities. So that was the framework and the approach that we identified. So we did something that was very bold. We had promised Oxford and the REACH project that we were going to be looking at water, and if women were able to negotiate their water roles and responsibilities, and also had a voice or say in the governance of water in public domains. But then we ended up doing something quite different. And that was really high risk, which was that we agreed that we would not focus on water. What we would do is we would collect everyday lived experiences, the lives of the women RMG workers in their homes, in their factories, and in the spaces in between, that we would collate these narratives, and we would then, through these narratives, see how water figured or not in the challenges that these women were grappling with. And so we also decided, applying this sort of a transformative citizen science approach, that we decided that there would not be questionnaires. We would meet with the women workers in ways and during periods that were convenient to them, not to us, that we would listen to their everyday experiences of their work, as I told you earlier. And also try and understand through these conversations the hopes, challenges, fears, and aspirations, and also really focus on the social relation aspect of it, because gender is essentially about social relations. It's not a proxy for women. Gender means the social construct of relationships. So we really wanted to understand how do, in a very patriarchal society like Bangladesh, how do the husbands of these RMG workers respond to their work, and how do they, engage and interact with the women at home, and does having paid, bringing income home and having, being able to run the house and contribute to the household income, does that change their status? And do they also get more support, and are they able to negotiate their domestic roles and responsibilities? But again, we decided that we were not going to be, posing like these trigger issues to the women, that we would simply listen to their stories. Now, listening to stories and doing this sort of transformative research is quite a challenge. It seems very simple, but it's really, it is quite a challenge, because it requires, fundamentally, it requires building trust. It's about the same issues that Linda Scott talked about, that why would a woman trust and tell me her fears, her concerns, talk about her relationship with me, a complete outsider, if she does not have trust? And how do you establish that trust? So for those of you who are interested, I'll share the presentation with Marina and she can pass it on. There's some of these techniques were something that people talked about earlier when there was this very early talk about participatory research, and then it became, participation and participatory research became very much maligned because of the ways in which they were being conducted. But they've come back now in another form called immersion. So what we also realized is that to really understand the lives and experiences of these women, we need to be living together. We need to be living in the same context. We need to be going about our lives in the ways that, these women also are going about their lives. So two of our researchers then therefore rented a room in the locality of the research, and they lived there for 3 to 4, I'm forgetting now, I think it was 3 or 4 months. And, and what we found is that there was a phenomenal difference when, they were actually living there, and there wasn't the rush to like rush in and rush out. They could actually have time to talk to the women. The women found that it was nice to go to the room of the two researchers sometimes. But what we also found is that increasingly women were bringing their problems, their most urgent problems, like leaving the children behind, leaving a sick child behind because they didn't have anybody at home, or because they didn't trust their husband to look after the child while they were away. And also increasingly in the evening, the researchers were being flooded by requests to teach the children because none of the children were going to school. School was too far away. The private schools nearby were expensive and not affordable. And the women really, this was one of their greatest anxieties, that they were bringing up a generation of children who were not going to be educated. And that if they were in the villages, they would have had education, but because of the lack of income, they had to migrate. So there was this great anxiety. And even though we did mention that we were only going to be there for a couple of months and it might not make a huge difference, but they were really emphatic that, they wanted at least some introduction to alphabets, anything, the semblance of some learning. And so what happened is that a lot of women started coming and meeting, and then, we also started calling meetings inside these rooms sometimes. And then we had an incident where we realized, what the sort of vulnerabilities these women experience, because at one point of time, we had a meeting and the landlord of the room that we had rented, and by the way, it's really interesting and fascinating because what we were renting was a room in an apartment, so this was a 3-bedroom apartment with 1 kitchen, 1 bathroom, meant for 1 family. But in reality, because of the rental rates, each family rented a room and shared the kitchen and the bathroom. So it was very much like a coexistence in that small space. And so when the landlord came and found and saw a large number of slippers outside the door of the apartment, and he found out that we were holding a meeting, he asked us to vacate the apartment immediately in less than 3 hours with no other options, not even a day to find another accommodation. Which then we found out was not very uncommon, that this is precisely what happens, that the relationships between the landlords and the tenants, the RMG factory workers, is precisely this. It's very unequal, and there is very little negotiation power that the tenants have with the landlord, whether it is how they should live in the apartments, how they should use water, at what times they can ask for water. and about the quality of wash services, etc. So the fact that we were ousted out of the house, and then the women helped us find another room, and all of these really helped build trust and sort of, I think the women felt that we were somewhat similar to them, even though that was not at all entirely true. But the fact that we lived there and the fact that we had experienced a problem that they experience every day was so fundamentally useful for building trust. So after 3 months of meeting these women and collecting their stories, we found out that water was really key to the lives of the women RMG workers. It was about wash, but it was not just about wash, water and sanitation and hygiene. So why was water so key? It was because, they live in small, crowded areas, several families sharing one bathroom, one kitchen with one tap stand. All of the women need to reach the factories by 8 o'clock in the morning, otherwise the gates are closed and they lose their daily wages. And so this meant that the women would often get up at around 4 o'clock, even 3 o'clock to make sure that they were able to cook, clean, wash the family's clothes and prepare for the rest of the day, and do this when it was not so crowded. And then they would come home at around 8 o'clock in the evening and again begin this whole task of preparing dinner and cleaning and washing, etc. But we also found out that this was, and the fact that their relationships with the landlords were very uneven, and even if they had lived in the area for almost 20 years, they did not have any bargaining power. But this was also because they all aspired to go home and they had not taken up local voting identities and local, the administrative identities that you can acquire when you've lived in a certain place. That was because every single one of them talked about going home one day. And the fact that the issue of water was not just about water that was essential for everyday domestic work, but it was really also about the fact that the ecological footprint of the RMG industry had deep repercussions on the quality of water. And this was a discussion that was not at all being had at any level of administrative policy, institutional levels. So there were really deeply sectoral silos around how women's work in the RMG industry was being looked at. There was a lot of work related to women working conditions in the factories and how women managed with that, about the salary, wages, and there was also there was talk going on and a project supported by the Asian Development Bank about, expanding water supply services to the peri-urban areas in Dhaka, of Dhaka, including the area in which we worked. But there was really not a lot of talk about, the ecological footprint of this deeply polluting industry and how that was, how it had resulted in pollution of the rivers, and also of the soil and of water that was being used from shallow hand pumps and tube wells, which was the source of water that was being consumed by most of these RMG workers, but also the local residents. And the reason that it's not talked about is because the RMG industry is so central to the economy of Bangladesh. So this is a really contentious issue. And the fact that the RMG industry is not only so pivotal to the Bangladeshi economy, but more recently, it's also identified the label of having addressed the gender gap, even though in reality, it creates very complex outcomes of gendered livability in peri-urban Dhaka. And what we also found out through our project was that paid work is important to women, undoubtedly, and that garment factory work, even though it is really strenuous, and the quality of work, the quality of the benefits and the norms, rules, regulations vary across different factories. Nonetheless, this is not decent work. And when I say decent work, it's based around the ILO definition of decent work, which includes living wages, which includes agency and ability to unionize, to ask for basic rights, benefits, etc. And the fact that if you look at the RMG industry more globally, not just in Dhaka, but to the high street fashion across Europe and the United States and the rest of the Northern Hemisphere, that you see that this capitalism and globalization combine with patriarchy in Bangladesh to shape really very gendered dimensions of living experiences for women working in the industry. And the fact that, the water was a cause of anxiety for the women, undoubtedly, but it was not just water, it was also really their health, the health of the children, not having access to childcare, knowing and recognizing that they were consuming water of very poor quality and that they were living in settings and contexts that were really hazardous. And just because they were poor did not mean that they did not know about it, or they did not feel the anxiety of this. And these were precisely the reasons that they wanted to really go back. And this issue about governance of water and whether, so it was very clear that women were not being able to negotiate their domestic roles and responsibilities at home, because I realized that I missed one key finding, is because the fact that women work and the fact that they bring home an income, as we found out, has a negative impact on masculinity in men. And it sort of, that men do not wish to do the sort of garment industry work that women do. At the same time, they resent the fact that their women are out in the public and perhaps meeting other men who are working as supervisors, etc. And the fact that they're living off the wages of their women, something that is not considered appropriate in Islam, was something that made the men very conscious and aware of re-emphasizing their masculinity in their social relationships with the women. So despite earning wages, women did not really get much support from men. And by the way, when I'm talking about all of these are generalized pictures that I'm giving you. as we also found out that there are individual differences, there between the lives of different women and men, and not all of it can be generalized. But nonetheless, this was the context in which the women were working. So one of our key recommendations going forward was that that the living environment of RMG workers is something that really needs to be looked at, and the water element of it needs to be looked at, but it also needs to be understood in the context of the reality that where tenant workers and migrant workers have very little agency, voice, and visibility, then, and where they are really dependent on landlords who are the sort of the broker between other services and their basic needs and the institutional arrangements towards these basic needs, then it also really needs to be looked at that just extending services or just improving wages is not going to automatically improve the lives of these women. Just to give you an example, during the time that we were doing our research, a long time call for improved wages was addressed by the government, and there was almost a 50% rise in the wages of garment factory workers. This was not what they had asked for. It was still half the amount that they had asked for, but nonetheless, it was a 50% increase. And Marina, you have your hand up.
Sorry, I really hate to interrupt you, but we have 10 minutes for the question. So if you can wrap up.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just going to wind up then. Yeah. So the thing is that as soon as the wages were increased, then the rents also increased proportionately, which meant that it didn't really result in an increase in income, real income for the RMG workers. So the approach that we took and the framework that we followed, which was feminist political ecology, allowed us to put power politics at the center of our analyses, both at the household as well as in the work that they did. It allowed us to really take critical analyses of the dominant narrative of women's empowerment. And we were able to do this by providing voice and visible and embodied experiences of work. So building on this, there is new work that we are aiming to take forward through a new project where we want to look at, the formal and informal institutions that shape food, water, and environment in the local context. And we want to see how women workers are able to engage or not in these institutions, and what opportunities exist through these engagements for improving well-being and livability. And once again, we want to adopt an approach where we want to work with both Tala, the theater group, and we want to use immersive theater to enable ready-made garment women workers to replay, capture, and explore ways to tackle these power dynamics. With Tala, we also created a video of the narratives and the stories, and this was an immersive theater where the women were able to come into the theater, eventually the play, and be able to decide the outcome of the narratives, that the stories that they were telling us, which was that while they all talked about going home, at the end of the theater, when they took a consensus and they realized that going home was not an option to them, and that they needed to come together and work towards more collective approaches to tackle the injustices they experience. Okay, that's it from me, Marina. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Deepa. It's your research. I obviously know it, as you know, but every time I listen, I feel it very inspiring and theoretically critical and methodologically transformative and ethical as a research per se. I have one question about empowerment that we have also from the audience on empowerment, so I will just combine them both. If you think of the concept of empowerment as such, how do you see it? How would you like to see its future? Because we use it so much. Would you say we should reduce it? We should not use it quantitatively? Can we do it quantitatively? And how should we do it in a empowering way? And then the second question is, if we think of other countries that are looking to develop their RMG industry, RMGs, what lessons should they take? Obviously into different contexts, but what kind of generic lessons you would like to give to them so that the industries are best prepared to empower women? Yeah, so I combined a couple of questions, both for myself and other people on empowerment. I think you're on mute. You're on mute, if you can unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry. Could you be so kind to repeat the questions? I had an audio trip just as you were speaking, sorry.
Okay, so questions on empowerment. How do you see development of the concept of empowerment? Because it's now used so much. Would you see it in the intersection of quantitative, qualitative, or only qualitative, or completely erased from academia, and how we should do it in an ethical and not disempowering way? And also, if we're about to give what you learned from the Bangladesh case and how it can be applied to other countries who are just about to launch RMGs, also where predominantly patriarchal culture and women would be involved in RMGs, how they should develop the industries in a way that would be more empowering women rather than not.
Okay, so first of all, on empowerment, that's a really complex question and difficult to answer in a short way, because I think fundamentally empowerment is about agency and in being able to decide and in being able to question and Martha Nussbaum, whose framework that we approached, says that individually, everybody has the agency and has capability. And in fact, the most marginalized have far more capability because they are surviving against the odds. But it is also essentially about the enabling environment, the political, the economic, the social environment that allows and responds to these issues. So in terms of research and in terms of analyzing empowerment, I think, fundamentally the ways in which empowerment is being analyzed in many contexts is very technical and very technocratic, with criteria and frameworks that are determined by external others. And even though these might be robust and look at different elements of women's lives and their agency, their assets, it still does not really, hand over the pen in participatory language. And so fundamentally, I think there have been many interesting projects like Pathways of Empowerment that was led by University of East Anglia, where it was identified that there is not one empowerment approach and there's not one empowerment narrative or framework that applies in all different local contexts. So it's also very much about the starting point, and it's also about taking into account the enabling or disabling context, and in being able to actually define, what might be key criteria and ways to define empowerment in different contexts. So I don't know if I answer your question, Marina, but that's what I have to say. In terms of the RMG industry taking off elsewhere, I mean, even if not taking, I know there are a lot of countries in Southeast Asia and elsewhere where RMG industry include also, I think in Africa, where there's, talk about the proliferation of these industries. But I think even closer home in South Asia, there are ready-made garment industries in Sri Lanka. And what might be very interesting is to do a comparative account of what's happening in Bangladesh with what's happening in Sri Lanka, because there's very little analysis. So what the information that exists is anecdotal and hearsay, but it is being pointed out that in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, the emphasis was on well-being and if not decent work conditions, then appropriate wages and appropriate working conditions above profit. Mm-hmm. That was the approach, and that is, for example, one of the criteria in Sri Lanka was that in these the industries would not be located in and around Colombo, which would require large numbers of women to migrate, that they would be located closer to the rural context or to peri-urban context, which would allow women to live in their own homes and be able to work. And I think for all of these reasons, the RMG industry in Sri Lanka is not doing fantastically well economically as in Bangladesh, but you also do not see or hear issues around women's challenges with this. Neither do you also see or hear of issues of the ecological footprint and the environmental impacts of the industry. So I think even within South Asia, it might be very nice to do a comparative analysis, but then I think this also has to go, if you look at, then it's also explanatory that the context, the Sri Lanka social welfare political context, I think has a lot to hold in terms of defining quite a different landscape for the industry.
Thank you. I think we will need to stop in a minute because we just finished in 1 hour. We will put it in YouTube, and Rob will just remind again where you can find it. And all the links that you have put here will also put separately later under the presentation, so people can look at your work. And if you have something to add from the theaters, if there's a special links, you can also post it later. As well as everyone is welcome, obviously, to continue discussion under the YouTube link. Thank you so much, Deepa. The time flew very quickly. It's a very broad topic that will be very interesting to continue. Ellie, you have a question, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. But you can write it down, and we will put it again on the YouTube, and maybe Deepa can answer a bit later.
Marina, I can take that question. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that I spoke for so long, so I can take a question or a couple of questions.
Oh, Ellie said that she was uploading. And she wasn't raising hand, she was uploading. Yeah, we had a quick question also, if at which stage your research could talk to local stakeholders, local government, how it can cooperate together.
Sorry, what did you say?
How your research can integrate local government as the right holders.
So from our understanding and knowledge, a lot of the governance around the peri-urban areas is informal, because, as I said, that this operates in an institutional vacuum. So, our first point of contact and the brokers in this process would be men and men who have the not a very I think favorable identification, the Mastans or Mastanism that exists in Bangladesh. But what I think we need to first work through this network and this understand the linkages between the informal brokers and the local communities, including RMG workers, and then take the next step into really looking at government institutions and actors. And I also maybe just want to mention here before I end that because of COVID, we are now restarting the work in April, and we would really welcome interns and master's thesis students. So if there are candidates at your end who are interested to either work in the field or to do secondary desk-based studies, then they are most welcome to contact me. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can drop me an email later, we can definitely send it through our networks as well.
Great, I will. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you so much. And it was a really interesting session. We had people from all over the world, which was great. And again, we will put it on YouTube. So I'm sure there will be even more people looking at this presentation and hopefully inspired by how you look at the research, and it can be applied to so many different areas. Thank you so much again, and I hope you have a nice weekend. Thank you, everyone. I know it's late in South Asia. We have some hearts and hands appearing. People clearly enjoyed the session. Thank you so much, and we will stop here.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.